Hello, welcome to the Language and Power podcast. I'm Michael Farrelly, and with me, as always, is Tom Bartlett. Hi, Tom.
Hello there. Hi there.
And our special guest today, Ben Clarke of the University of Gothenburg. Hi, Ben.
Hi.
Good to have you with us. We have taken this opportunity to speak with Ben about a paper that we heard at a conference in Glasgow, which we've also had an episode on in this series earlier on. And unfortunately, Ben couldn't make it to the recording of that episode, so we decided that we'd have Ben on, not just because of that, but because he's got a really interesting paper. The topic of your paper, Ben, is biophilia and common ground. What are we talking about when we talk about biophilia and common ground?
Sure. So there are two ideas that have come up in lots of disciplines and lots of work, including linguistics to some degree. So biophilia is the concept of human nature connectedness, the fact that we as a human species have evolved within wider nature, and that for our well-being, our survival, our flourishing, we depend on being close to wider nature. So that's other species, but also plant life, water bodies, etc. That's biophilia in short. Common ground is used in lots of different ways. It has a meaning within linguistics, going back to kind of like psycholinguistics, language acquisition. But it's also used more generally in communication studies to refer to trying to find a space where people can get behind a shared idea and work democratically on an idea that they can all get around.
Yeah, great. And you're interested in that in terms of why should people be interested or be bothered by doing things that are ecologically sound? Is that where we're coming from?
I think it reflects something that's more generally true about my research. When asked to turn up at various places and talk about what I do with my research, I tend to say that there's two main things I'm interested in. I'm interested in how communication can be used in democratic contexts. Since I moved to Gothenburg, I'm in a department of applied IT, so I need to think about this in relation to digital communication, which I think is interesting. How can democracy be done online? It gets kind of questions of polarization, mis- and disinformation, incivility, how they're similar, but also how they're different from their offline embodied equivalents. So that's one thing I'm interested in, digital democracy, communicating online and how that causes problems. The other thing that I describe myself as doing with my research is looking at questions of the representation of the environment, typically in relation to climate change, but not only. For example, one person who was on the previous podcast was my PhD student and one of my collaborators, John Curry. He and his other supervisor, Daniel East-Fryer, we've been working on representations of climate change, for example, in relation to metaphors, to make sense of this omnipresent, far-reaching concept of climate change. And when I describe these two things as what my research is made up of, I have to think it's hard to describe in a clear way why those two things go together, but they fundamentally do. When we think about the problems we're experiencing now, like around the world, there's a lot of wars. Democracy itself in a number of places in the world seems to be crumbling or under threat or not functioning in the way that we have understood it for long periods of time. I think this relates very much to the environment and the environmental crises that we have. Many wars are partly about space and habitation of space for peoples of those nation states. If we think about the environment and we think about loss to biodiversity that we've seen in recent decades, this is also about space, how we organize ourselves in modern day life, with big urban spaces where people's access to nature is limited or challenging in many respects. And so I think these things are very, very heavily intertwined. Democracy and the kind of environmental and ecological problems. It's not very easy or evident to describe how they're intertwined, but I think they really, really are. And I think those two things are involved in many challenges, problems, whatever you want to say, that we see in the modern day.
No, I mean, that calls to mind Nancy Fraser. I don't know if you know her, I'm talking about, eco-socialism she talks about, but the point being that these problems cannot be solved in isolation. They're also integrated, that we need to find ways of solving them together. So I suppose in that way, the notion of common ground can mean quite a lot of different things. What do you mean as a starting point, or what scope do you give to common ground? Do you keep it deliberately quite open, or do you narrow down what you mean by common ground? What is it to you?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not something that I've looked at in huge detail. I know it's used in a lot of ways. So there's a bit of a Habermasian way of trying to use communication and language to rationally debate, like, what is the way forward, to try to find consensus and to try to agree on what the way forward is best to move things forward. So I have a fairly loose notion of common ground. I don't think it's particularly strict. I'm not looking at people disagreeing, like truth reference, getting around a propositional base or something like this. I'm just more interested in how we phrase or have a language for talking about the environment. We could go back to metaphors, for example, that would move us forward in understanding some of the difficult decisions we as humanity or societies have to make to improve the situations for our own survival, the survival of the species. How do we build a broad church so that we can have discourses for talking about climate change, talking about our relationship to other species, to the wider environment, that resonate with people and that people can get behind? And I know, Tom, this is something you've been interested in relation to positive discourse analysis. If we formulate discourses of the environment this way, that sounds good, that's better, sure. But what is their likelihood of uptake in the discourse communities, right? Are they likely to resonate given what a society values, ideologically speaking? I think there's so much work for linguists, discourse analysis, communication scholars, psychologists, who I have the good fortune of working with here in the department I'm at Gothenburg University, because they're sat sort of alongside me in terms of our institutional makeup. All those people have so much to offer about what might be those discourses that resonate with people. So we can look at like behavioral change. If we formulate something one way or another way, and it's something we've been exploring just recently in terms of metaphors again, what is the likelihood of people making more climate conscious decisions?
There's quite a lot in there. I like that of resonate rather than being exactly the same. It's not common ground only resonating across a broad church is a really nice working definition. From what you're saying, it seems like the broad church covers a lot of people, different academics working together, different communities, different areas of policy. It's a sort of an open-ended question and just working away and see what resonances you can achieve and hopefully translating them into action, as you say. That might take decades to prove.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, as you say, it's both a question of academically having a broad church, as in, I don't think that answers from communication or linguistics or discourse analysis alone are going to be enough. I think we have to look at kind of how that impacts people's responses, where then we need psychology or something like it to help us. I think we also need to think about how we design online spaces. This is another thing that is kind of bringing together those two strands of my research as I see it. So, it's fairly well established that depending on what kind of digital space we have, it affords or constrains the possibilities for doing more or less polarization, incivility, etc. But I think the same thing is true about how we organize those spaces to think about the environment. So right now, it's an extremely early stage project, but I'm working with a couple of people here, for example, a research engineer, to think about if we design these spaces in ways that are digital spaces, ways that are biophilically sympathetic. Might that mean that people have more healthy relationships with digital devices as well? The very mechanical, angular, white page is not particularly natural. It's not how for centuries people have been used to reading. Our use of text and graphics and designs online are not particularly sensitive to our biophilic relationships and the rest of the embodied world. So could we design spaces that are a little bit more natural, so to speak, in the digital environment?
I wasn't aware of that angle. That's really interesting, moving away from the page. And one of the things that reminds the book by Abrams, where he talks about language. It's great and enables us to communicate and move away and look at problems from a higher level. It creates a level of divide between us and the natural world. We have textuality, where the text becomes reality in itself, and we actually have this disconnect from nature. But the idea that having it on the page rather than all these things that mass media and modern technology can afford us, maybe allow us to experience or feel closer to nature in a different way. That's really interesting.
Yeah, exactly. There is a little bit of work there from psychology, for example. There's a scholar at the University of Exeter, Smalley. He's looked at this with acoustic sounds in radio. They had a big BBC project where they were interested in a kind of, if you were used to those sounds, would you be more likely to kind of do climate conscious things? Many disciplines involved in this question. We know it's often a challenge finding bridges between different disciplines where we can work together with our different expertise on questions of an environmental nature. And obviously, there's a lot of interest to do so. Yeah.
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, but just going for this idea of biophilia in the first place is a step towards that, isn't it? Because I think in the paper that you gave, you contrasted it with the idea of deep ecology, where that idea is we should value nature for its intrinsic value. It's just valuable by itself, separate to human interests, I guess. But biophilia kind of slightly alters that starting point, where you're saying we don't have to just value it for its own value. We value it because it's intrinsically part of us. That intrinsicness is part of our well-being. And so there's a kind of, ironically, almost a sort of slight selfishness to the idea of biophilia. We want to help nature because we are nature and it makes us feel better. So am I getting that right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's exactly correct. Yeah, so the idea of biophilia goes back to a scholar from natural sciences called Edward Wilson, and he wrote this book called Biophilia in 1984. I only chanced upon it a few years ago, and it's a weird book actually, because he's writing about field trips that he's done in various places in the world, and he's becoming aware of how intrinsically he is connected to the natural world. And then there are moments that are quite like field notes on the work he's doing, and then things that are much more philosophical. And that kicked off this idea of biophilia. People have worked with it since. He worked with another scholar, Clarke, and they had this quite nice book, an edited collection in 1993, where there's a paper by, and I forget, it might be a single scholar, it might be two scholars. They write exactly kind of the thesis that you've just described. It is a bit selfish, right? It's like we should have self-interest in this because our livelihood, our thriving, our mental well-being, our physical well-being depends on us having a healthy relationship with the rest of the world. So, of course, you could say we're doing that out of self-interest. But the alternative is we don't survive on the planet, which I think many people would want to continue to survive, and many people are interested in their kids naturally thriving. So I think these are spaces for discourses that might resonate with people. If that's to happen, then we need to have a healthy relationship with the rest of the natural world. There's a lot of research out there in environmental psychology that tests if people spend time in nature before doing some kind of learning task, their ability to recall information is much better than those who don't have that. We need that relationship with the wider world in a healthy way for our own thriving, because we've, as Wilson would put it, grown up as a part of wider nature, and our healthy existence depends on us having a good relationship with the wider natural world.
Yeah, incredible. And there's also, you mentioned at some point this evoking feelings of nostalgia, but also intergenerational memory, which I think is interesting.
I think lots of people would describe this in terms of things that connect them with the natural world. So I guess for me, and I know many people think the same way who run, like being outside and running in nature is something so basic. Earlier on in our species, we needed it for survival and thriving in terms of, catching food to live, to sustain us. So it's such a basic thing that is there and ingrained in our DNA that we're untapping things that our forefathers, foremothers have known and done, things that are good for us. This is kind of like intergenerational memory, and Wilson describes this nicely in lots of places in that 1984 book, Biophilia, which kind of feels like a bit of a religious experience, tapping into, I guess, activities that we have done, our species that is, for centuries and centuries and centuries, that are they're there inside us and waiting to be enlivened. And being in nature is one of those things. For example, again, back to psychology research, scholars have tested, if people are given choices of several vistas, we will always choose water bodies. Water bodies have been important for our survival, yes, in terms of quenching thirst, but also, in terms of washing, and there's lots of things that we gravitate towards water bodies. They're important for our well-being in lots of regards. And of course, that's changed. How we organize society now is different. We can get bottled water off the shelf, but that kind of intergenerational memory, the need for these things and the want to then be close to them in ways that will, say, more authentic in decades, centuries gone past, is still kind of there inside us, waiting to be awakened.
Yeah, and it strikes me when you're speaking like this, one of the benefits, connections to discourse is if we're speaking about climate change or environmental degradation more generally, this idea of focusing on what makes it concrete to people. You feel that you want to be in an environment which is flourishing and thriving. You want to see forests that are full of green and not being degraded. That brings it to a human level rather than the more abstract scientific notions that you sometimes get of figures about changing parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere, which can feel very distant to people's own experiences. So this thinking of discourses in this way and thinking about how can we address environmental issues, making it more, I guess, personal, species-based as well. Part of your argument then is that this will be a way to enhance our understanding and capability of acting in a eco-sensitive way, I suppose. Is that what you're arguing?
I think it comes back to the fact that biophilia, sort of a part of its heart, does have this self-interest, right? So I think that is kind of there. I mean, in terms of our thriving as species, as individuals, we have had to have a selfish gene that has meant that we choose, ourselves and our survival to thrive. We see this in how people live their lives. We do seem to be a very selfish species, which is probably important for our surviving and thriving. So if those are the discourses that offer the possibility to resonate, I think at least we should think about them. I've already hear the counter arguments, but when we think about the situation that we're in right now and the fact that we don't seem to be moving forward with solving the environmental crisis and the fact that we see increasing species decline, so many SDGs not being fulfilled so many years further on, I think there's a space for research to experiment around things that we might think are not the best way forward on the face of it, but if that changes people's behaviour, then maybe it's worth exploring.
Really interested in what you said about biophilia, which is human-centred in a way, but not human-dominated. It's reading a book, Harmonious Discourse Analysis, developed in China, and it's this idea that it's not nature for nature's sake, it's humanity at the centre, but as a responsible agent within a wide ecosystem. So very similar to the trend that's coming around in linguistic it's now, but also appealing to the selfish gene, as it were. We survive as a species. We're not God's missionaries on Earth to protect the world. As we mentioned earlier, we have evolved a lot as part of a wider environment. Our continued existence depends on that, as opposed to something I bang on about a lot with the Promethean myth that we will solve all our problems. You get this all the time. Science and technology or the market will solve the problem because mankind always has. So it's a shift away from that while still remaining human focused in a way, because that's who you're selling this discourse to. You're not selling it to the birds and the bees and all the water that is now falling down on my windows in Glasgow. I'm right in the midst of nature here, but protected by a thin roof. Where does the linguistics per se come in? As a linguist or as a discourse analyst, where does the linguist come in, and where do they act? Who do you work with, and what do you try and do? What's your mission, Ben?
It's a good question. It's a difficult one to answer, obviously, but I think there's at least a couple of fairly clear answers. One very concrete one, I would say, is with psychologists in thinking about how we formulate messages around the environment, around things related to the environment. So, for example, energy, our use of fossil fuels, climate conscious decisions around, travel, consumerism, whatever, to find ways people will opt for the more climate conscious choice. There's obviously problems there with implementation, which businesses are going to go for, selling less because that's the sustainable solution. Well, probably smaller businesses that do have a kind of ethical stance, but sure, big business is probably not going to go for that. I think around psychology and messaging and effects of messaging and encouraging more climate conscious actions, there's a lot of work for linguists and discourse analysts to do alongside psychologists in terms of doing experimental studies that test the effectiveness of certain messages. We're working on that right now here, a couple of us at Gothenburg, and we've been exploring metaphors, for example. There's a little bit of research that goes in this direction. There's a scholar, Stephen Flusberg, at New York City University. He and his colleagues, sometimes Elena Seminole works with him at Lancaster. They look at message effectiveness with metaphors and test responses to that. So they had a study in 2017 that looked at this in a news media context, and they found that formulating climate change as a war or fight. That was quite effective for getting people to opt in for more climate conscious decisions. Whereas journey metaphors were moot, they didn't have a positive effect at all. People were just kind of like, okay, that's nice, but didn't change their
What would a journey metaphor
behaviors.
look like?
They're often used in business, right? So the road to net zero emissions, being a crossroads for something, the path to X. This is something that John, my PhD student, is working on a little bit right now. What is the moving vehicle in a journey? Is it climate change itself? So are we trying to slow down the effects of climate change, or is it climate action that then we might want to speed up, right? I don't think much research has tested that. What's the object that's moving through the journey, and how might that be effective? It wasn't something that Flusberg and his colleagues looked at, for example. They, I think, were working with really climate change as the moving vehicle. But we tested this again. We found that war wasn't effective in an energy provision context we had in our experimental study. We found that framing climate change as an illness was effective. And we wonder if there's like a COVID-19 memory thing going on, or just a kind of moralizing discourse of not wanting to associate with bugs. Maybe that partly then was alerted by this COVID-19 memory. And it's a metaphor, some of the discourse analysis literature. So, for example, there's a nice paper by Silver and Katakos, a few years old now. They looked at that metaphor, the war metaphor, the religion metaphor. They found that the illness metaphor framing wasn't much used in Anglospheric discourses, it's more used in German language data that they were looking at, news data. So we wonder, like, okay, is there something to be explored there? So that work with psychologists is one work that definitely has to be done, I think. But then there's another body of work that I don't really know what it looks like. I'm trying to figure this out so I can do some of it. I think this work on looking at big data, probably in corpus stuff, looks at, what kind of formulations, metaphors, wording, metaphorical entailments, I don't know, are likely to have uptake because they are used a lot in current discourse contexts. For example, I was thinking recently about glue metaphors and web metaphors. Web metaphors have been talked a little bit in the literature, but not much. Are there things there that we could look at? Because we talk about the glue that binds us together, or the glue that binds communities together. So there seems to be a discourse there that might resonate with people. So I think there's research to be done by discourse analysts on large scale with big corpora, looking at the likelihood of uptake or resonation in discourse communities of certain discursive patterns, whether they are metaphorical, whether they are about transitivity, whether they are about agency, modality. I think there's work to be done there as well.
But interesting, a couple of times you mentioned the German-speaking world, the Anglophone world, but also different contexts there. So one particular approach is not going to be a one-size-fits-all. It's going to have to bear in mind different contexts, different audience, different histories and that sort of thing, and different socioeconomic statuses, I suppose, as well.
Yeah, I think so. And we've talked about the different stakeholders that are involved here. There are activists who clearly have an invested interest, but they have an interest in turning around the environmental crisis. Working with them, one could imagine, to try to find ways where formulating their messages would resonate with other stakeholders seems to be an important task to undertake. But, there is big business that I don't think we can entirely shy away from. And we also need to have discussion with and try to find ways that maybe we can live in a more ecologically sustainable pattern. One can imagine that maybe many people working in that context are open to that. There's obviously also politicians, etc. So I think there's a lot of stakeholders with which this work also needs to be done. Local communities, Tom, I know something that you've worked on before. There's so much to be done.
Really interested.
I'm really interested in what these ideas look like in concrete terms. And in the paper that you gave in the conference in Glasgow, you gave a couple of really concrete examples from two different texts, and you'd done an analysis of transitivity in those. Would you mind talking us through a little bit of what you found in your analysis of those texts? I think you were talking about parts of these texts which spoke to a kind of eco-destructive kind of way of thinking, others that were much more positive towards nature and the environment, and then you also found ways of writing in these two different texts which you identified as being common in terms of their discursive kind of underpinnings. Could you talk about those a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Very small textual analysis of two texts. One was the introduction to a book by William Henry Searle called Threads. It's a nature memoir. It talks about his life and important times in his life and recounts stories. Often they involve like nature as a central component. And in Len Stibbe's terms, we might want to call this, I think it wouldn't be too controversial to say, a fairly like ecologically beneficial discourse. He really values nature. Nature is central to how he lives his life, the memories that he has. It's a prominent theme in the book. And then the other piece I was contrasting this with was a piece from the conservative magazine from the UK, The Spectator. There's a piece written a few years ago about rewilding. It was written in response to changes in governmental policy or potential changes in governmental policy. This is about the topic of rewilding, which has been a discussion that's run and people have quite vested opinions on. So and this then, I guess, is much more kind of like ecologically destructive, I would argue, when we look at how man or human and nature represented in that opinion editorial piece, I guess, from The Spectator. And what I found there, so I was working with Halliday transitivity framework for looking at how grammar is worded kind of like semantically and looking for patterns there where they differed and where they had overlap to see if we can find some of this kind of common ground. It was small scale analysis. It's not an example of big data corpus-based research. It's much smaller scale. What I found there was somewhat similar to previous research. Scholar Andrew Goatley has also talked about patterns of transitivity where human is in kind of actor role, the doer, and nature is in some kind of done-to role, passive. And these are not particularly positive ways, one might speculate, of representing us and nature. Probably it's good to see that nature itself is animate in other species. One would imagine that other animals, other species experience things, think things, communicate things, etc. And yet, in texts like this one, they aren't enshrined those discourse roles. They are kind of done-tos of material actions a lot of the time. So yeah, Goatley describes this as being an ecologically destructive pattern in the grammar of then English. These texts are obviously. Something that is seen in the Threads book are patterns that are kind of like give nature reference roles of doers of or experiences of mental actions, so kind of like thinking and experiencing in those ways, which potentially allows us as humans to empathize with nature and other species if we can understand that they also think and speculate around the things that they might think or appreciate or like. That might be good for finding this empathy, a step towards this common ground. And then I guess the final thing to pull out of the analysis was one thing that they had in common. Both these texts talked about nature reference in relational transitivity terms, which is not hugely surprising finding or something like this, because studies within Halliday linguistics would suggest that relational transitivity in the vast majority of texts is fairly prominent, right? We expect that relating one thing to another is something that a text has to do to evolve. Often when we bring in discourse agents for the first time, we have experiential clauses. There was a so-and-so, that then that so-and-so is going to be central to the rest of the text. So it's not surprising that a nature reference would be involved in relational transitivity, but it seemed to be a fairly common thread in these two quite short texts that they were playing roles in relational transitivity in a diversity of different types of relational transitivity. So nature reference were brought in as existence, and they were there, right? They were brought in these special existential clauses. Nature reference played a role in locating things in relation to other things, so they were like important places in the texts. But also in both texts, they were evaluated positively, given positive appraisals in terms of being beautiful or wonderful or these kind of things. So, maybe this is a common ground that one could go and explore on a larger scale with more texts or in corpora, I think might be a good way forward. Is this how lots of different types of texts talk about nature? Is relational transitivity a discourse pattern that we can start from to bring in people who might be more skeptical to the need for modifying patterns of modern day human behavior to appreciate what nature is and what it does for them?
Yeah. Do you have any quotes from the text that would illustrate that?
Sure. So this destructive pattern then in the Spectator, we see things like, to quote, "It's still the hand of man that created the essential layout of the landscape." So man is doer and Landscape is just created of man's activities. Another example, again from the same text, the Great British Landscape has been largely shaped by agriculture. So human processes, agriculture doing the shaping of, in this case, the British landscape. These are ecologically destructive patterns that I was finding in that text, very similar to Andrew Goatley's work, looking at transitivity analysis of nature-related texts. And then if we think about this common ground, so where there was relational patterns in both texts that draw nature reference, we have things like existential subtypes of relational. Quote, there are even white storks nesting in the trees. That's from Spectator, the more ecologically destructive text. In Threads, the more ecologically beneficial. There is a chance to bridge the divide between ourselves, one another, and the natural world. So identifying things, existentials, have important discourse functions, right? They bring things into a text that often become picked up again or somehow important again. Bringing in nature in that way is maybe something that we can think about when we're looking for these more positive types of discourse.
I think you're giving individual examples, of course. It's not a question of whether these sentences are actually true or false in the real world, whether, the British environment was shaped by agriculture or not. It's not a question of whether that's true or false. It's not a question of individual sentences either. It's tendencies over the whole of the text, isn't it? Over the long term, describe, if you relate to the environment in this way, over the patterns, as Rukai Hassan would say, rather than the individual instances. It's not saying, oh, that's true, that's false, that's a lie. This perspective on nature as something created by man or something that's just there in itself is what creates this different image.
Exactly.
So you're suggesting that one of the things that there's a common ground between the texts in terms of seeing nature as existing as being and being and having in its own right, rather than people working on it or it working on people. Just appreciating what is there seems to be a common ground over the two texts that can be picked up in different ways.
Exactly. And this brings us full circle and back to biophilia. I think somewhere in Wilson's writing, he talks about nature giving us a reassuring context, in that when we've had a bad day, to have a walk probably does a lot of good, particularly if we can be out in the forest or something like this, a park or something where we're surrounded by nature. And I mean, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that taking in the smell of the trees and the things that we're being exposed to are good for our bodies. We've been used to it for a long time. So it's this finding a context in nature that we, like further back in our DNA and in our species, we have thrived from, and continuing still to find our context and thrive from it again.
I think it was originally the $64,000 question, but inflation must have made it at least 64 trillion, the 64 zillion dollar question, Ben, which is Elon Musk's annual salary. When you found the common ground, if it's already there and you're a linguist finding it, what can we do with it to nudge the world into a better place?
Yeah, that is a big question, and it would certainly be 64 trillion in kroner as well. Difficult question to answer, but I think nudge is an interesting word, right? Because if you think about the language and psychology stuff, it is nudging. That's kind of what it is. There are kind of ethical questions about nudging. Should we nudge? Is it moral to nudge people towards more ecologically beneficial discourses or not? I'm not sure, but I think an interim or like a midway answer to this question is identifying, I think, stakeholders that we want to work with and trying to encourage them the value of our results, right? So, for example, activists, I keep coming back to activists, but I think they're an important group. They have changed the discourse for a period. So another paper that I'm working on, again, with John and Daniel, actually, we're looking at how nature was talked about during the period 2015 to 2024, so like 10 years in the Houses of Parliament. And something interesting happens sort of 2018, 19, 20. We've been working with a corpus approaches and a corpus tool designed by people at Lancaster called usage fluctuation analysis. It's really clear in the analysis that things suddenly change in that period, but they quickly go back. Activists have some kind of impact. Greta goes and talks to the Parliament, right? I think that's 2019. And it seems to like change what politicians are talking about in the Houses of Parliament. Suddenly the voices of activists themselves are a lot more represented. People in their local communities who are taking part in these protests, particularly young people, the scientists themselves, because I guess that's what the activists are saying, listen to the science, suddenly changed. So it has an impact. So I think they're grassroots pressure groups that can have an impact. But what we want to see is a sustained impact, not just a brief impact. Because in our analysis, in the paper I just referred to, it's fleeting. It happens for kind of 1 or 2 years, and then things very much go back to normal. It's talk about policy, technological answers. It's talk about the economy resolving things again. That all comes back where it was there before. You get this sudden change in 18, 19, 20, but it changes. So I think, to come back to your 64 trillion Swedish krona question, I don't know, I can't answer it, and therefore I don't deserve the money. But I think the mid step is to try to work with groups that we think are likely to have an important stake in this, and to try to show them how the communication could work or work better for them.
Okay, so really, a point there that you made that's really interesting to me. I mean, in a way, people could call that covert nudging. You're not willing to do it, but you're working with groups that do. So,
Sure.
Yeah, we've all got positionalities. But no, I really like that. The really interesting part I get there is instead of nudging action ourselves or even working directly with groups to create alternative discourses, what you're doing with your analysis and the common ground potential is you're identifying discourses that keep the communication open, that allow other actors more competent than ourselves, more scientific than ourselves, widening the field of discourse and therefore letting them make all the changes to their discourse themselves. But what you're finding through this analysis is common ground is just saying keeping this dialogue open rather than pushing it one way or the other, and opening the dialogue to more and more potential influences rather than us saying what we like, which is my big carp with some versions of positive discourse analysis. It's just about keeping the dialogue open and, in a sense, not killing off any of it, because you don't want a victor, because if you've got a victor, you lose the dialogue.
Yeah, exactly. And here we are back to this kind of environment democracy, right? Should we nudge and tell people this is the way to do things? It doesn't feel particularly democratic. But if we can inform citizens and key stakeholders about what might be more positive ways, what might be ways that are likely to have uptake in discourse communities, then we give them that knowledge. That seems pretty democratic. I think that's the way forward, to keep the discourse space open and to try to find ways of talking about and encouraging others to talk about the environment in ways that might resonate, whether that is metaphors, whether it is transitivity patterns, and having a common ground like that. Exactly.
Brilliant, yeah.
Absolutely fantastic.
So, taking all that together, you talk about, you're opening this connection between biophilia and positive discourse analysis. What we mean by positive discourse analysis is something Michael and I have talked about between ourselves and with other people quite often on the podcast. What do we mean by positive? How do you do it? Also, a talk I just gave for Michael on the idea of, you and I have talked about ourselves, Ben, is it'd been immanent critique and ways forward have to come from, not from ourselves, but from the people we're working with. And it sounds like your approach is about opening up possibilities that relate to all sorts of different people for them to build on themselves. Is this conversation about what positive discourse analysis is, or interventionist discourse analysis, anything you want to call it rather than giving it a particular label, is this a conversation that's still very much one in progress?
Yeah, I think so. As a field, PDA, positive discourse analysis, is still relatively new compared to the work that's been going on with critical discourse analysis. So initially comes about as something as a reaction to that. But I think that discussion will continue. It's also good to remember that people are interested in that same kind of question, but wouldn't knowingly or unknowingly call themselves positive discourse analysts. And I think it's like finding them to be involved in this work, right? So they're probably interested in articulating a better way to talk about the environment. I'm reminded of a book by a natural scientist, Brendan Larson. It's quite a few years ago now, 2011, I think. I can't remember the title of the book, but it's something like Metaphors for Environmental Sustainability. He's someone sort of like crossing over to become the discourse analyst or linguist, right? And talking about the kinds of metaphors that scientists use. What he's doing there is fundamentally an undertaking which is interested in the same kind of question: can we find a more positive language for talking about the environment? So I think, it is going to continue. Is this where I'm then meant to play?
And Ben, you are organising the next European Systemic Functional Linguistics Congress in Gothenburg. As part of the event, you will have a panel from various people talking about their visions of positive discourse analysis, what it means, and where we go from there. Maybe we'll have a podcast to follow up on that as well.
Yeah, exactly. It'll take place next year, 3rd of July, 2026. The conference theme is related to environmental sustainability. We hope that people will present on that topic. And as you say, Tom, there will be a panel which will involve yourself and Jim Martin, so we can get your two different views on PDA. And hopefully a number of other people will be there as speakers and audience to try to figure out the way forward. What kind of work can we do and how might we do it? So that's something to look forward to.
Yeah.
And if you've got a link, we can put that in the show description.
Great.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating discussion, and you've taken us on quite a journey there, Ben. Thank you so much for giving us your time and your insights on all of that. Really fascinating. Thank you on all of that. Really fascinating.